Christian church can and should be one of the most inclusive spaces around for trans people, but sadly, it is not. Hi, my name is Braeden. I am a pastor in the Christian tradition, and I'm a PhD student in religion and theology. Today, I want to spend some time talking about how churches can be more inclusive of trans folks. If you are totally on board with all of that, then this video is for you in terms of how your church can then take steps to be more inclusive and affirming of trans people. If that is not you, specifically if you identify as a Christian and you are not affirming of trans folks, then just keep on scrolling. Find another video to watch. Do not leave a hateful comment because let's be honest, there's enough hate in the world. And if you identify as a Christian, you should not contribute to that hate. But with all that being said, let's jump into how churches can be more affirming and inclusive of trans folks. Within my denomination, the Disciples of Christ, as well as the sister denomination, the United Church of Christ, there's often reference to the 3 P's of inclusion. The 3 P's being policy, publicity, and proclamation. Let's start with policy. If you want to be an inclusive church, have it in your policy. Have it explicitly talked about. Don't just have it be something that the pastor believes, but actually isn't in your church's bylaws and policies. Actually have it in there that it says trans people can serve in leadership, in all levels of leadership, from volunteering to greet, to being an actual pastor of the congregation. Because so often there's this rhetoric in churches of, oh yes, we accept everyone. Yet when you actually get down to it, what they mean by we accept everyone is, yes, you can sit in our chairs and you can put money in the basket, but you can't actually be a leader. You can't actually fully be yourself and fully be a part of the life of the church. So the first P, policy, have it part of your policy explicitly listed. That is, people are aware that you are a welcoming church for trans people and you fully affirm and embrace and celebrate the gifts that they bring to the table. The second P is publicity. So don't just have it be in a policy somewhere on the back shelf, but actually have it listed as something that you publicize. Have it on your website. Have it be something that when people come through the doors that they are aware that people can come to the church and be fully aware that this is a fully LGBT affirming church, and specifically mention that it is a trans affirming church, because the unfortunate reality is that even in the LGBT community, people might be welcoming of someone who is lesbian, bisexual, gay, but they might not be accepting of someone's gender identity, because as I said in the first video, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression are 2 different things. So sometimes someone might be accepting of people based on their sexual orientations, but maybe not on their gender identity variations and various gender expressions. And so explicitly, publicly say that you welcome, affirm, embrace, and celebrate people of all gender identities and expressions. Then lastly, there is proclamation. Why proclamation is just what is being proclaimed. So yes, it might be on the website, yes, it might be in a policy, but is it something that in the proclamation of Scripture, that when the pastor preaches, when the pastor speaks about the Scriptures and exhorts it to the congregation, is it something that is explicitly talked about, that trans people are mentioned? Is it something that when the pastor is proclaiming and speaking to the congregation, they say brothers and sisters, which kind of naturally excludes non-binary folks? Can they just say siblings? Or can there be something that is not super specific and speaking about the way you're born and the way that maybe your biological inclined? There tends to be this focus in churches that is very, very cis-normative. And by cis-normative, I mean cisgender, people who identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. We tend to preach and proclaim and speak about the scriptures and life in very heteronormative and very cisnormative terms. So how can the proclamation begin to move in those ways? And so those are the three broad categories, but I want to kind of talk about multiple ways in each of those that can be moved toward. And so to talk about that, I want to talk about just kind of bigger barriers for inclusion for trans folks, as well as what a welcoming community can look like. So one of the things to think about when it comes to barriers to participation is really, of course, overt hostility, but then there is also just fear and unfamiliarity on the part of the congregation. Because let's be honest, there are many people who perhaps want to be inclusive, but just don't have the tools and resources. There is unfamiliarity. It is gender identity and expression is new to them. And so being able to equip people, to educate people with the language and resources to help people through this. And so that is part of what this series does, to talk about the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation, to talk about some of the terms that are offensive. And so to really engage with some of this is very, very important. And so seek to educate yourself personally, to have ongoing education, but also bring that to the congregation as well. And then secondly, in the barriers, there is the physical layout or even programming that separates people based on gender. This is a very common reality in church. It is very common for restrooms to have men and women restrooms. This often creates a dilemma for people who identify as trans, who worry if someone will identify them as trans and maybe tell them that they should go in the bathroom that they were of the sex that they were assigned at birth rather than the gender that they identify and express themselves as. So ultimately, to seek to have gender neutral restrooms in your space is very, very important, to work toward moving toward that. So that way it's something where people don't feel the need if they identify as trans or even if they identify as non-binary. And then there's the reality of programming. It is quite common to separate programming based on gender. And so to really find some sort of healthy approach there, if you still choose to have some sort of programming by gender, to welcome people, if it's a women's event, to really make it explicit to that it is welcome to anyone who identifies as a woman. Or if it is a men's event, to welcome anyone who identifies as a man. Or you can simply do away with creating events that are specific to genders, because ultimately humans are all dealing with human issues and human questions. And so ultimately to just have an all-inclusive space and to not separate them based on this. There are lots of other distinctions that you can separate groups on. You can separate it based on age, you can separate it based on season of life, but ultimately you do not have to separate it based on gender, because that creates lots and lots of dilemmas. Ultimately though, when it comes to creating a welcoming community, the number one thing is just a generous hospitality, a genuine hope and movement toward wanting to welcome people. That is ultimately what hospitality is just this desire to welcome everyone. And so if you are someone who might say the wrong thing or who doesn't totally understand different groups, then whether it be trans folks, whether it be people of different ages and generations, whatever it might be, to just have a heart of hospitality, to really take a hard look at yourself and to want to include and to be aware. Am I someone who is closed off to new and different, or am I someone who is welcoming to new and different people than what I'm familiar with? Then in terms of creating a welcoming community, to just be aware of the language that is used, to really look at the liturgies. This is very easy in churches that are very much scripted in their liturgies. You can look at what is being said, really be conscientious of the language, of how this could be perceived and received by various groups of people. So, for example, in the mention of liturgies or in the mention of just how things are spoken about in church, to really have the presence of trans people be visually and audibly present. So, when speaking about various categories of people that are welcome, to explicitly mention trans people, as I said, oftentimes we just group LGBTQ all together. But as I said, sexual orientation and gender identity are different. And so oftentimes there might be transphobia even within the LGBT community. So oftentimes when people hear LGBT inclusive, there's still that filter of, okay, they might be accepting of sexual orientation, but maybe not so much of various gender identities and expressions. And so to explicitly talk about trans inclusion and to talk about trans people at the table of faith is so important. And on that note of the fact that many trans folks, when they hear LGBTQ inclusion, they might just assume, oh, that church or that place or that space is welcoming of gay people, of people who identify as a particular sexual orientation, but they might not be welcoming of trans people of varying gender identities and expressions. And so to reach out to various trans groups to make it known that this is a space that is welcoming, that celebrates, and actually is in support of the trans community, that is so helpful, even if they don't come to church, to not have some ulterior motive of getting them to come to your church, but to ultimately just make sure that it is known to the trans folks in your city, in your community, that they have allies. And that's ultimately what all this is about, is being an ally, being someone who is welcoming, who celebrates, who affirms, and to not worry about always saying or doing the right thing, but to ultimately just wanting to include and having that genuine heart of hospitality and always being on this journey of growth. We will always have ways in which we can grow. We will always have ways in which we can celebrate and embrace people more. And so to embrace that as an ongoing call is so radically important. And if you follow these different things, if you have this heart of genuine hospitality and generous hospitality, of wanting to welcome absolutely everyone and knowing that God celebrates and affirms and embraces everyone, then you will be on the journey toward being a more inclusive community of trans folks and all people. Now, I've said this phrase multiple times of celebrating trans people, and I want to talk more about that because we celebrate many things in the life of an individual. We celebrate marriages, we celebrate baptism, we celebrate communion. Depending on the tradition you come from, there's celebrating of confirmation. So the simple question I want to pose is, what if we included somebody embracing their true identity as a trans person as one of those things that we celebrate in the life of the church? There are tons of ceremonies and liturgies online of how people are doing this in churches right now. It can be placed as part of the worship service, embedded in the flow of the liturgy, or it can be something that takes place after church or even on a separate day. Just as churches embed baptism in the service, or maybe do it after service, or have a special baptism service, there are tons of different ways that one can celebrate people's trans identities. And through embracing these sorts of ceremonies and rituals and liturgies, it becomes very clear to trans people who are part of the congregation or who are looking in. It is very clear that this isn't something that is just on their website for the sake of bringing in people. It isn't just something that is said, hey, we accept all people, but that it is very clear that we truly celebrate all people at our church. We celebrate trans folks. So think through some sort of actual ceremony or ritual that can be done for trans people in your church and community if they would like. And make sure to have it on your website, to have it be something as part of the events that people can book if they would like to. Because honestly, just like weddings, someone might not be a part of your church, but they might want to host this sort of ceremony or ritual at your church because it's very meaningful to them. And so it can be a way of touching the lives of individuals beyond your church community.